Right now, I'd like to introduce another one of our speakers, Mr. Peter White, one of the founders of the Appleseed Marksmanship Program, as well as the author of the Western Rifle Shooters blog. Mr. Peter White.
Good morning. Thank you again for your support of Ms. Melissa and I. That's a pretty scary thing to do. Thank you even more for coming out here. As Dan mentioned before, all of you had a decision to make and some logistics to handle and some budgeting and balancing of other priorities, and I sincerely thank all of you for coming out. So one more hand for all of us who came out here today. Today, April 19th, 235 years ago, 1775, the Battle of Lexington and Concord and Battle Road. You'll hear about that and have heard about that from other folks here today. I want to talk this morning about another April 19th. It's fading into history. It's fading out of living memory. But it was a stand for human rights equal to, and in some ways, even greater than what our forefathers took on the green at Lexington and that day back in North America in 1775. By April 19th, 1943, the men and women of occupied Europe had been, if you start the clock in 1933 and run through 1936, 1938, 1939, 1940, 1941, had been living under the boot of National Socialist oppression, of a governmental tyranny very seldom equaled in modern times and very seldom equaled in history, in human history. By April 19th, 1943, in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Jews of Warsaw had been behind brick walls and fences and were being slowly starved to death and being killed by disease. And still, the Nazi overlords in Warsaw, their bloodlust was not satisfied. So in addition to dying of disease, of starvation, sadly and shamefully enough, members of that Jewish community in the Warsaw Ghetto worked with and collaborated with the Nazi overlords to try to appease them, to try and satisfy their bloodlust by designating members of their own religion, of their own nation, of their own people as sacrificial lambs, with the hope that by sacrificing some of their own by their own hand, handing them over to the Nazi overlords for transports to the east, to death camps and labor camps further in Poland, that somehow a few Jewish folks in the Warsaw Ghetto could be preserved. And they would say to those who objected in their community, we cannot stand against the Nazis. They have all the guns. They have all the tanks. They have all the power. We must appease them. We must sacrifice our own people so that a few of us survived. But in that community, in the weeks running up to April 19th, 1943, there were what I call bad Jews. Bad Jews who did not buy that line of their society, who said they must appease tyranny, that they must turn others over to the Nazi overlords in order to save themselves. Those bad Jews said no. Those bad Jews knew that when it comes down to it, in the end, there are only principles. And those principles include the absolute sanctity of every human life, the absolute dignity of every human being, and the absolute and irrevocable right of every human being, of every human life, to stand and defend him or herself against tyranny. Yeah. Absolute rights, absolute first principles, irrevocable, unalienable. And those bad Jews those minorities, those few, dare I say those 3% in the Warsaw Ghetto, they said no. And by hook or by crook, they armed themselves. Pathetically armed themselves, or armed themselves with a pathetic amount of arms and ammunition. And on the morning of April 19th, 1943, knowing that another transport from the ghetto was being held later that week by the Nazi overlords, taking more and more Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto, where they weren't dying fast enough from starvation and from disease and from neglect. They knew, those bad Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto, they knew that another transport was being formed and thousands of more of their innocent Jewish brothers and sisters and children would be taken to be killed. And they said no, and they said, we will stand on those first principles. If it is only you and me and you, we will not go quietly. And they began what is known as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, which lasted more than 10 days, which diverted tens of thousands of Nazi both security and regular troops into the ghettos, into the Warsaw Ghetto, where at the end the Nazi overlords were forced to move from house to house with explosives and fire and poison gas, filling the sewers and basements and the ruins that were left. And still, the bad Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto fought on. And we know of their sacrifice, and we know of their courage, and we know of their bravery, and we know of their commitment to first principles, because a few of them survived. They survived to witness what happened. They survived to tell us what the majority of their community said in the face of tyranny, to appease, to sacrifice, to try and make them go away without the prospect of force. Now, thankfully, those people survived, and they told us that lesson, and it still lives in living memory today for a few more years. As you remember this date, standing here with your brothers and sisters on this beautiful piece of ground that, not coincidentally, I would suggest, belonged as part of the farm of the first president and founding father George Washington, here on this ground where we stand today, I want you to remember not only our forefathers in New England on April 19th, 1775, but I want you also to remember our Jewish brothers and sisters in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I want you to remember April 19th, 1943, and what that date means to them and to us. And I want you to remember those first principles. Every human right, every human life has dignity. Every human being has the right to self-defense, whether it's defense against an individual criminal or mass organized criminality. And that final principle is that sometimes we are asked to stand even at the risk of our lives to defend our brothers and sisters and our basic human rights. Remember that this day. Remember this day, and remember yourselves among those who stood for human rights, for the dignity of life, and for America on this day. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.